Merhaba. That's Maltese for welcome, I hope. And this is City Breaks Valletta, Episode 3. I'm Marion Jones. And this episode is called Finding the Knights of Malta in Valletta. You certainly will find them. They are everywhere, or traces of them are, as I hope this episode will explain. For instance, you'll see the Cross of Malta all over the place in souvenir shops, on signs, in guidebooks and lots of other places. The 8-pointed cross, which the knights chose as their symbol and had emblazoned all over their tunics and buildings. And you'll see references to the knights all over the place on plaques, in guidebook explanations. They built this, they did that. But it all goes way beyond theory because much of what they built is still there to be enjoyed today. Not least, actually, the whole city of Valletta, which they built from scratch after their victory at the Great Siege of 1565, when they'd so defended the island that they decided this was the place to stay and make their forever home. Many of the most beautiful buildings in Valletta date right back to the knights, the auberge, for example, the Grand Master's palace, the fortresses, and so it's no exaggeration to say that they are everywhere. This episode then, a little bit of history to explain who they were, something on all the main buildings where you can find them, and to finish, a mini-biography of the most famous one of them all, the one you've heard of, even if you don't know it yet, Jean de Valletta, after whom the city of Valletta was named. So, who were they? They were the Order of St. John, made up of noble young men from most of the important families in Europe. The sort of thing where you might keep your oldest and perhaps second son close to the family to inherit whatever you owned, and then you'd perhaps send the third or fourth along to prove himself by joining the Order of St. John. They were based in Jerusalem, where their role was quite muscular really, defending Christians during the Crusades, looking after pilgrims, escorting people, looking after and safeguarding people's wealth. And yes, they themselves did become quite rich. And all of this summarises their life until 1187, when disaster struck, at least from their point of view, because Jerusalem, where they were based, was taken by the Muslims, and the knights were forced to flee. Now, I didn't want to get too lost in the detail, and the next very significant date I found was 1530, so well over 300 years later. What had they been doing in that time? Well, wandering really all round the Mediterranean, making a home here and there, being chased away again. There's evidence that they were in Cyprus, for example. They were on Rhodes. Generally pretty homeless until 1530, when Charles V of Spain bailed them out. He agreed to lease them the island of Malta. A generous offer, although at first sight not one without its problems, because the soil on Malta is very poor, so it was going to be difficult to grow food. They'd have to import a lot. There were no forests, therefore very little wood, so fuel was going to be a problem. No rivers either, so that convenient method of transport before the engine was invented, also not an option. But it did also offer a number of advantages, not least the fact that someone was offering to give it to them as a home, and also the fact that it had 2 fine harbours and a very strategic position mid-Mediterranean. So they accepted the offer and settled down, and began building fortifications, which you can still visit today, so think the Fort St. Angelo over at Birgu and Fort St. Elmo on the tip of the peninsula where Valletta now stands. There followed 30-plus years of settling in, and then the great moment which was going to define the Knights on Malta for evermore, namely the Great Siege of 1565, when the island was attacked by thousands of Ottomans and defended by the knights aided by the people of Malta. It's hard to overstate the significance of this event. For the knights themselves, of course, defending their relatively new homeland. For Malta itself, which was able to demonstrate a level of resilience and an ability to defend itself from invaders, which was going to come in pretty handy a few centuries later in World War II. But actually also for Europe more generally, because Malta, as described in a previous episode, was very much on the crossroads of Africa and Europe and the Middle East. Christian, when much of what lay to the south was Muslim, and if it had been taken by the Ottomans, that would very much have meant Christianity retreating and Islam advancing. I found 2 quotations which sum this up rather well. The first is from Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman emperor who ordered the invasion, and said, "This cursed island is like a barrier interposed between us and our possessions. So yes, strategically vital, let's take it." And the other one is from Jean de Valletta himself, so the Grand Master of the Order of St. John at the time of the invasion, who summed it up as follows: "This is the great battle of the Cross and the Koran, which is now to be fought. A formidable army of infidels are on the point of invading our island." So his arguments were territorial, reference to our island, but also religious. His determination to safeguard the Christian faith. And added to the importance of the whole thing is just the drama of it. A real David and Goliath story, because the Ottoman troops numbered tens of thousands. I've seen different numbers, anything from 40 to 60,000, and defending the island were something like 6,000 to 8,000 knights, helped by the indigenous Maltese population who had been living on the island before their arrival. This victory against the odds has been talked about ever since on the island of Malta. Here, for example, is Nuria Rain introducing the chapter in her book, The History of Malta, on the Great Siege. "In the annals of military history, the Great Siege of Malta stands as a defining moment, showcasing the resilience and bravery of the Knights of St. John and the Maltese people against the mighty Ottoman Empire." So then, we're in 1565. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent has decided capturing Malta is the thing to do. He's chosen a general, one Mustafa Pasha. He's collected together over 200 ships and, as I said, tens of thousands of men, and sent them off to Malta, where 6,000 to 8,000 knights are waiting to try and defeat this formidable force. The whole thing began on the 18th of May, 1565, and lasted several months, right into September. The Ottomans attacked repeatedly, bombarding the fortifications which the knights had built. The knights launched counterattacks. Many waves of Ottomans were driven back, although not always. Fort St. Elmo, for example, was eventually taken after 4 weeks of heavy fighting. But the knights kept going. The Maltese people helped them, helped to rebuild things that had been destroyed, providing supplies, tending to the wounded. And finally, on September the 8th, came a turning point, because relief troops arrived from Spain and Sicily. They managed to inflict heavy losses on the Ottomans, with the result that, after a few days, they began to retreat. The siege was over, Malta had been defended, and the knights were staying put. This was seen as a huge event in Europe. No less a writer than Voltaire, the French philosopher and playwright, wrote that, quote, "Nothing is better known than the siege of Malta." And while that perhaps is not quite so true today, it certainly is the case that the victory then plays into the idea of brave little Malta, which was such a story during World War II, several centuries later. It was a turning point for the island then, but also for the knights, because it was the moment when they realised that they had managed to defend their relatively new homeland and decided that they would stay put and make it their permanent home. And almost immediately after the siege had ended, the building began. And many of the buildings still there today, which we associate with the knights, date from this period. Not least the auberge, originally 8 beautiful mansions, although not all of them remain today. So one thing I haven't mentioned is that the knights subdivided into 8 different groups known as langues, the French for languages, depending on where they had come from originally. So some were named after countries, France, Germany, England, Italy. Others took names from areas which today are areas of modern-day countries, so 2 from France, Auvergne and Provence, and 2 more from Spain, Aragon and Castile. And each built their own beautiful auberge, a place for them to live and work, several of which are still there today. And then there are the churches, starting in 1566, so less than a year after the siege had come to an end, with the building of the Our Lady of Victory Church, and also, of course, the magnificent St. John's Cathedral. Not forgetting the Grand Master's Palace, begun in 1567, so again just 2 years after the siege was ended, and somewhere called the Infirmary, which sounds a bit like infirmary, hospital, because that was the other function which the Knights fulfilled, and which I haven't mentioned yet. They worked in healing the sick, in running hospitals. So all of those are places you can visit today, but I really ought to make the most obvious thing very clear, and that's the fact that they founded completely the city of Valletta itself. Built as their capital on a very strategically chosen piece of high ground, overlooking what was to become known as the Grand Harbour. And this huge project can be termed the first planned city in Europe. And that is why there's a grid system of streets, so 2 main streets running east to west, with connecting streets between them and connecting streets running from them down to the coast on each side, and major squares for some of the fanciest buildings. So one for the Cathedral, one for the Grand Master's Palace, one for some of the auberges. Something to bear in mind whenever you are wandering through the city of Valletta. And what I'd like to do now is run through the main buildings in the city which you can visit to find out more about the Knights. Starting with the auberge. So there were 8, one for each order. Some were destroyed in World War II, but some of them are still today there, some of the finest buildings, in fact, in the whole of Valletta. So the Auberge de Castile, for example, built by the Knights of the Castilian Order. Not everything which you see when you stand outside it today dates from the 16th century, but nevertheless it does serve as an example of the splendour to which they aspired. You can't go inside this one because it's a government building, but you can stand outside and admire the central entrance with its steps and columns, its Maltese and EU fluttering flags, its bust of one of the Grand Masters sitting right on top, a couple of cannons sitting outside. Definitely a building of swagger. And just around the corner from that, at the top of Merchant Street, is another auberge, the Italian one, which you can get inside, because today it's used as the National Art Museum. Before you get to the pay desk, you can get inside the courtyard, admire the well in the middle, look around at the wonderful architecture, and take a seat because it's run as a cafe. And there's another one, the Auberge de Provence, which is also a museum and therefore has public access, and that's on Republic Street and is now the National Museum of Archaeology. And then, of course, grander than any of the ordinary auberge is the Grand Master's Palace, begun in 1567, so just 2 years after the end of the siege, a real statement that they were here to stay and intending to live in really quite some splendour. The outside is certainly impressive, wonderful stone facade, carvings, beautiful green balconies. You see those all over the island, but these were in fact the originals. They don't all date from the beginning of the Knights period. Some were added in later centuries, but they are very beautiful, very Maltese, highly photogenic. And here too you can get inside, where you will find a whole collection of treasures, starting with the courtyards and the main corridor that runs around all 4 sides with its beautiful marble floors, covered in the coats of arms of various Grand Masters from the past, and walls decorated all the way round with paintings of famous battle scenes. And off these 4 corridors sit a whole array of rooms from the days when the Grand Masters ruled here. Things like the throne room where dignitaries were received still are today, I believe. It's one of those splendid red and gold rooms that you get in royal palaces. Think velvet chandeliers, portraits of many of the past Grand Masters, and more paintings showing the history of the Knights on the island. There's also the Grand Council Chamber, where the business was done, both in the days of the Knights, but also subsequently when the building served as Malta's Parliament. And the theme here is very much gold, gold and more gold. Think embossed wallpaper, golden chairs, balconies. There's a whole host of other rooms you can visit too with fancy titles. And one more thing which many people seek out, and that's the Armoury. The Knights were, of course, a fighting force, so they tried to make sure they always had the latest in weaponry, and much of it has been collected together and put on display here. And it works really as a history of weaponry or a history of warfare, because it starts with swords and moves on through guns to cannons. Loads of examples of all of those, fascinating, I should imagine, for anybody really interested in the history of warfare. If that's not really your thing, you'll perhaps just have a quick look, but I'm sure you will be taken by things like the life-size model of a knight on horseback. Not far up the road from the Grand Master's Palace is one of the Knights' other magnificent buildings, namely St John's Cathedral, dedicated in 1577, so only 12 years after the siege. They must have started building it pretty much straight away, I think. Dedicated to St John the Baptist, who is the patron saint of the Order of the Knights of St John, paid for by the Grand Master at the time, at least the original building was, and then later Grand Masters gave magnificent donations when they were elected. In fact, I think all knights, on being accepted into the order, had to make some sort of gift or donation, and that helps to explain why there is so much extravagant finery on display here. The outside and the inside of this building are really quite contrasting. Outside, it's an imposing stone building, quite austere really, and you have no idea of the splendour which is going to open up as soon as you walk inside until you try it. I enjoyed reading some of the description in the rough guide, where the author described it being like entering a brilliant jewellery box, and wrote of the interior as being a blaze of Baroque art. And yes, your first impression, I think, will be gold. The walls are covered in gilded this, that and the other. There are golden pillars and lots of golden ornaments. Next, you might notice that the Maltese Cross features heavily in the decorations. Perhaps you'll spot the ceiling paintings, 18 of which depict the life of John the Baptist, and you will surely find your way into the oratory, where two of the cathedral's greatest treasures are kept, namely the two Caravaggio paintings. Caravaggio was briefly in Malta. He was even, despite his previous history for roguery and thuggery, accepted into the Order of St John, and these paintings, I think, were his gift to the order. Others gave money, weapons and whatnot, but Caravaggio gave his painting, and the big one, the beheading of St John the Baptist, is there in the oratory exactly where he painted it. So that's very special. And the second one, the smaller one, is called St Jerome Writing. There's a little film playing in there on a loop telling you his life story, and in fact I'll be coming back to the paintings in the art episode further down the line. Meanwhile, other links to the knights in St John's, the side chapels. There are 8 side chapels, yes, one for each long, or order, each little havens of more art and gold and splendifery, and in some cases the tombs of some of their Grand Masters. Something you certainly mustn't miss is the floor, because that is amazing too. Over 350 marble inlays, each one the grave of a knight, because the most influential knights in each generation were allowed to be buried here. And they often planned ahead the Latin inscription they wanted for their epitaph, the pictures and symbols they wanted to be shown. So they are all individual, but they also form a whole because of the colour scheme. Red, black, cream and gold. Near the altar you might notice a throne, the episcopal throne as it's called, where the Grand Master used to sit. And finally, in one of the side chapels, is the tomb of Jean de Valletta himself. A couple more buildings very linked to the knights that are definitely worth visiting are the Church of Our Lady of Victory, built in thanksgiving for the victory after the siege, the original burial place actually of Jean de Valletta, although his tomb was moved once the cathedral had been finished. Don't forget, by the way, if you go to that church, to stop in the square outside and look at his statue. And the other building I wanted to mention briefly is the Infirmary, or to give it its full name, the Sacra Infirmaria, which translates as Holy Infirmary or Holy Hospital, built in 1574, so again as part of the initial surge straight after the siege. And interesting because it represents the other thing the knights were really famous for, and that is their tending the sick, their work, if you like, as Knights Hospitaliers, as they were also sometimes called. So linked to the work that the original members of the order had done in Jerusalem, defending pilgrims who came to visit the city, tending to them when they got injured or ill, and something which grew into one of the main things that the order became famous for. You can get inside the Infirmary to look round. You have to start by going to something called the Malta Experience, which is a 45-minute film about the history of Malta. Quite a good thing to do on one of your first days on the island. And after that, they will take you on a guided tour of the Infirmary. and tell you about the reputation of the Knights for the work they did treating the sick, treating actually everybody irrespective of their religion, and how usually whenever they set up somewhere new, the things they did first were building a church, building their own homes of course, and building a hospital. The building's interesting in itself. It is huge. I've seen it described as the longest unsupported hall in Europe, 155 metres long, soaring ribbed vaults and space underneath, would you believe, for up to 900 beds. It was used as a hospital, actually, right up until the end of World War I. And the Knights were famed far and wide for the quality of their treatment and the service that they gave. In a little booklet about the Knights of Malta, I found this statement. The service given in the hospital was unique in Europe, with patients being served their food on silver plates by the Knights themselves. So very much an example of their Christian duty to care for others. The hospital became a centre of excellence in the 17th century when one of the Grand Masters founded a school of anatomy and surgery here, one of the first in Europe, and one which gained a really good reputation for advancing medical knowledge. So, between the auberge and the palace, the churches and the hospital, you really can get a sense of what it was the Knights of St. John stood for. And to finish the episode, a mini-biography of the most famous of them all, Jean de Valletta, who was really quite a character. Originally French, he was born in 1494, and in the 60 years or so before he was elected Grand Master of the Knights in Malta, he led really quite an adventurous, action-filled, daring-do sort of existence. He was originally at least no saint. He was once imprisoned for attacking someone. Sounds like Caravaggio, doesn't it? He had a whole string of other misadventures. He was captured in battle, for example, and kept as a galley slave for over a year, only freed in an exchange of prisoners. He was also governor of Tripoli at one point, and a captain general in the Knights, someone whose long and exciting history had led him to become admired and respected, to the point at which he was elected by the Knights to be their Grand Master. That was in 1557, and I found a description of him from about that period, which read as follows. He was, quote, a very handsome man, speaking several languages fluently, good man, including Italian, Spanish, Greek, Arabic, and Turkish. And it fell to him to be the Grand Master of the Order at the time of the Siege of Malta, and to finish off his career as the man who led the defence of the island, rebuffed the Ottomans, and then in celebration founded the city which was named after him, Valletta. Actually, I read that the original name of the city was, this is Latin, Humilissima Civitas Vallettae, which translates as the most humble city of Valletta. And just 3 years after this magnificent victory, in 1568, he died, and was accorded the honour of being the very first person to be buried in the Church of Our Lady of Victories, although a few years later it was deemed more suitable to move his body and put his new tomb in St. John's Cathedral, where the inscription on his tomb reads as follows. Here lies La Valletta, worthy of eternal honour, he who was once the scourge of Africa and Asia, and the shield of Europe, whence he expelled the barbarians by his holy arms, is the first to be buried in this beloved city, whose founder he was. So then I hope that as you're wandering around Valletta, past and into its splendid buildings, and keep seeing references to the Knights of St. John, you'll feel a little better informed about who they were and why their influence on this little island has been remembered ever since as so important. There are really two moments in history which colour everything as far as Malta's past is concerned, one being the period of the Knights of St. John, and particularly the moment of their victory in the Great Siege, and their building of so much of the capital city and its splendours afterwards, and the other being the period which I'm going to address in the next episode, namely what happened to Malta in World War II. Again, there's a whole range of places you can visit where that period will keep coming up, and so to know a little bit about what happened on Malta in the 1940s is to much better understand the places that you visit and the reasons why the people of Malta, awarded the George Cross no less for their resilience during that time, are so proud of that particular moment in their history. So I hope you'll join me for that. Meanwhile, can I remind you that there's a blog post to go along with this episode, available on the website www.citybreakspodcast.co.uk, a summary of what I've said, lots of pictures, lots of links, a few ideas for further reading. And while you're there, perhaps you'd like to have a look around at some of the other cities we've covered. Somewhere you've been, perhaps, if you'd like to reminisce, or maybe somewhere where you're thinking of going. If you have a moment to have a look, I hope you'll enjoy what you find there. For the moment, though, I need to just resurrect my notes on how to say goodbye in Maltese and sign off for today. So, here we go. Thank you and goodbye, I think. Grazie hufna, saha.